understanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hello, people. How are you this evening? I hope you are well. I'm getting through to midweek. I hope you're hanging on for dear life and ready for Friday drinks already. That'd be great, wouldn't it? Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. Thanks for joining us for this one-off special on accessibility in maths. Maths teachers out there, of course, you might be following Teachers Talk Radio Maths, Teachers Talk Maths. If you are, welcome to you. You could be watching us on LinkedIn or YouTube or even on X. You could be watching us anywhere. Thank you very much for spending a little bit of time with us tonight to talk about accessibility in maths. If you want to get involved in the conversation tonight, of course, we are completely live, so you can make a comment on X or YouTube or LinkedIn. We welcome those comments. Of course, you might have a question or anything else. Please fire it into us live and we'll try and discuss it if we can, or even better, we'll try and answer it if we can, if it's a question. I am joined tonight by a friend, an old friend and a fantastic maths teacher and an amazing person, which is Kathryn Clark. Kathryn, how are you?
I don't know what I did to deserve that intro. Thank you very much, Tom.
Very true. If anybody doesn't know, Kathryn used to be the Teachers Talk Maths subject lead. But more than that, is a very experienced maths teacher. And it's amazing to be able to co-host a show with you, Kathryn, tonight. Because you know how good I am at maths with my...
So good. It's your favourite, isn't it? Yeah.
Listen, I always have told you, if I'd have had accessibility in maths, it would have helped me massively, or at least even if I'd just been aware of it, I think it could have helped me hugely. Which is why, moving on to the context of tonight's show, we've got Neil and Caroline from OCR. We'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment. But first, Kathryn, is there anything you want to say before we kick off the show on this topic of accessibility in maths?
I think for me, there's just a big question mark over how many people feel maths is accessible in general. So I think anything we can do to make it feel a little bit more friendly, particularly around exams, where people really associate maths with being this horrible thing, would definitely be something for me that I would want to just do for everybody. And I know generally when we think about accessibility, it's about specific things that we do for specific SAND requirements, etc. But for me, it's just about making sure that all students can succeed the best that they possibly can. And it's really nice that we're getting to speak to Neil and Caroline tonight to discuss how the exam boards can help us do that as well. So it doesn't feel like we're quite so alone in the classroom of wanting to make the kids really enjoy their maths lessons and want to do well.
Fantastic. Well, listen, I'll start with Caroline. Caroline, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly as one of our esteemed guests this evening?
Thank you, Tom. Yes, my name's Caroline. I have been working at OCR, within the maths department, within the maths team for over 20 years. So I've been here a long time. So my specialism is assessment. That's what I've done.
Brilliant. And Neil?
So, yes, similar to Caroline, I work in OCR, specifically within the maths team as a subject advisor. So really kind of the role is kind of working at the intersection between the exam board and the people delivering our qualifications. So the role generally covers designing resources, reviewing resources, speaking to teachers, answering queries, and answering kind of things going on social media, delivering training, going out to speak at conferences, heads of maths meetings, things like that. So kind of in terms of the role, it's very much kind of the public facing side of it. But yeah, so I've been with OCR about a little over 12 years now, I think. So good amount of time, obviously working with the different GCSE maths qualifications that we've had in that time. So obviously we were kind of key part of reform towards the 9 to 1 qualifications that was happening around a decade ago now. It's kind of quite a while that these 9 to 1 qualifications have been around. So continuing to support teachers throughout that time, and obviously still getting involved in kind of the current, things that are going on with supporting teachers, but also, formula sheets that is kind of going on at the moment, kind of discussions with Ofqual around that, which I know perhaps we'll be talking about formula sheets when it comes to accessibility a bit later on. But there we go. Brilliant.
Well, do you know what? That's quite a varied role you've got, actually. It sounds interesting, there's a lot going on there, isn't there?
I don't think any day has ever been the same.
Yeah.
You can't, as much as I would like to, you can rarely even plan a day in the morning. You sort of say, I want to do this, and then things come in and queries come in.
And then you end up on Teachers Talk Radio, and you're like, oh my God, I didn't think I'd be doing this last week,
No different to life in the classroom, really, either. You can't predict that. So we're on a level playing field for sure.
Yeah, similarly, yeah. We'll fight in the good fight.
Brilliant.
So I guess I'll start with just asking you guys, you've had a little bit about how I feel about accessibility. What does accessibility mean in general and to you guys at OCR?
Either of you can kick off. Feel free. Just jump in.
Do you want me to go off with that one then? So,
yeah, I'll jump in if needed.
Essentially, to me, accessibility is the ability for us to assess students on what the qualification is aiming to assess. Mm-hmm. So, if it's a maths qualification, that we're assessing students on their ability to do maths. If it's a history qualification, their ability to, know about history and things like that. Whenever we create, write, design, put forward a question paper in front of students, and we're going to talk about more than question papers, but I'll focus on question papers right now. There's obviously a lot on the page. There's words, charts, diagrams, tables, all of that the student has to view, interact with, engage with. Not all of that is maths, kind of like the words, the language, and the things like that. Charts, diagrams, perhaps they are part of the content, but at the same time, we want students to be able to engage with them as best we can so that we can assess their ability to carry out the maths rather than being put off by a badly designed chart or table or things like that, or a badly worded question, with excess words and things like that. So that's kind of what it is to me on kind of like the upper level. And there's all different ways that I'm sure we're going to go on to kind of as to what makes all of that up. But kind of that's sort of an easy definition that I tend to reach to.
As you're going to notice, I'm going to nip in with really stupid questions. But one of my stupid questions that came to my mind was, are you the people who actually write them? You?
No, that's not our responsibility, that one.
But do you feed into that though? Do you or not?
We used to some time ago. Now that's kept completely separate. So we have a team of writers, and we're kept separate so that we can talk to schools, and there's no chance of anything untoward being said or saying things we shouldn't. So that's why we have that gap.
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, there was a lot more crossover and kind of, the kind of role that Caroline and I work in now. At that time, 10 years ago, yes, we would have been getting involved in the question papers, but for a number of very good reasons, there's kind of like been, separate groups set up so that, yes, essentially anyone going out to speak in schools now or delivering training or, perhaps even writing resources, they are not really allowed. And this is kind of with all boards and Ofqual.
Okay.
Then they're not really allowed to be involved in the creation of live question paper material. So the sorts of material that Caroline and I might be getting involved in that is kind of seen by teachers would be the resources, the training materials, things like that, but also possibly kind of practice papers or the sample papers that were created
Sample papers,
right at the initial start of the question paper's lifetime. So I mean, I had a hand in writing some of the questions that are on our current GCSE maths sample papers and the practice papers, but for live exams, no, it's quite a separate thing, and for very good reasons.
Got you. I'll let Kathryn carry on now. I'm going to keep making these questions I'm fascinated about throughout from an outside perspective. Carry on.
Ask away, Tom. Ask away.
Is there anything you want to add, Caroline, on accessibility within OCR or why it's needed?
Yeah, I mean, accessibility. I mean, there's kind of like three parts to it, really. You want it's got to be easy to understand. So the language, as Neil said, it's talking about we are looking to assess what the subject actually is about. So there's that. It obviously has to be a valid assessment, so that as Neil again said, it measures only what we need to know. So about the maths, not about what's their English like, can they understand this? It's just the maths. And then it's got to try and be fair as possible to as many students.
So my next question is a little bit kind of heading towards assessment specifically, and maybe you don't get involved in those live exams, but you are looking at what the assessment may look like when you're looking at the specification and those practice papers you've just mentioned. What does it look like in those assessments? I'll go to Caroline first, seeing as assessment is literally in your job title.
At OCR, Cambridge University Breast Assessment, which is our entire company, we do have we have a set of accessibility principles, and it covers quite a huge amount of things. Obviously, not everything in there applies to every subject, and a lot of that is based off Ofqual's general conditions. They have a section on guidance for exam boards and accessibility in assessments that we produce, and we've kind of, how should I say, we've taken some of the words out, and then that's what everyone is working towards, but it covers a huge amount of things. So we're trying to ensure that we are improving the readability of our papers. There's many ways we do it, but for example, we're trying to use short sentences. We're trying to just use language that is in the specification. We're not trying to add new words in last minute. We try and use Arial font, and that's been shown to be easier to read. Again, it's familiarity, so familiar context that hopefully students would be aware of, or even if it's not something that they've necessarily experienced, but they've seen it in our past papers, they get a feel for it. The clarity is something that we're looking to increase each time. And again, there's we could talk for ages about all the different things that are being done. But when it comes to the clarity, then again, as I say, we're trying to make it easier for the candidates or the students to understand the question, what they need to do. So keywords, we'd often put them in bold to draw their attention to it. If we have images, then we try and make them as clear as possible. Neil, would you like to add more to that? Because there is many more things that we could say.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like any of the things Caroline said, I think we could dive into a bit more. It's a case of kind of how much, detail you or anyone listening in and wanting to comment kind of wants to know about all of those things. But I mean,
I do. I'm very interested in that. Seriously.
I mean, if you've got a question, go for it. I mean,
I mean, just the one thing that was coming into my mind while you were talking was around is this more of a recent development for you? Is this because, or is this something? I suppose what I'm getting at is when I sat my exams in 2001, 2003, there didn't feel like there was any consideration of these things. The questions, I mean, I can't remember specific questions, but I certainly remember there being things like, I don't know, John Bobbins visited the Commercial Institute of whatever studies, and he asked for this and this and this in the maths paper. You're like, I don't know what a Commercial Institute is, and I don't, that sort of thing. And also there wasn't really the stuff that you were talking about, Caroline, in terms of the consideration of the font or the consideration of, I didn't feel those things existed. So I suppose when I say recent, I'm not talking about months. I'm talking about how's this movement evolved, and has it evolved for you? And you obviously care deeply about this, otherwise you wouldn't be talking about it here. So I suppose I'm just getting a flavor of the evolution of it.
I mean, yeah, you're definitely right that kind of like in the past, and when you go back to look at past papers, a lot of them, they don't seem to be very accessible. I mean, you sort of try and maintain in your head that, language was a bit different back then, and perhaps kind of questions on particular, I don't know, sports or topics might have been more common knowledge back then than they are now. So things definitely do change in time, when it comes to those things. But yes, to come back to the question, in terms of accessibility, I think that there has been a massive change in perhaps, it's hard to say kind of when it began, but let's go with about a decade, sort of particularly over the last 10 years, there seems to have been a change in focus to, really consider a lot of these things and really kind of start having a look at all the fine detail things that Caroline was touching on earlier. And I think a lot of that, we might have aimed to do or intended to do in the past, or a particular author might have aimed to do it, but it hasn't really been standardized. It hasn't really kind of had specific principles written together, which is kind of like one of the things that we have done, and we can talk about them more specifically. A lot of what Caroline said kind of is included in them. But I think another big change that's happened over that period of time is there's been a huge amount of research that has been done and written and published all about accessibility and looking at all these different kind of things. If you were looking at fonts, I don't know, 20 years ago, I don't really think that there would have been, a fraction of the amount of research that
only Times
now.
New Roman existed 10 years ago, Neil. I don't think anything else ever was there. No.
Well, yeah. And, now, it's surprising the amount of research that's out there all about fonts and how they can influence us. And, you just have to look at the world of, graphics and animation and, or, I don't know, kind of adverts and things like that to know that, some fonts, they just seem exciting, and some fonts seem a bit more serious, and some fonts seem a bit wacky and crazy. And, all of these, kind of emotions are carried simply by the design of the letters that we read. And that's obviously prevalent in the world around us, but not really what we want in a maths exam. We want something that's going to be clear, straightforward, easy to read, and not really carrying any kind of emotional weight that, we don't want to kind of be triggering anything for the students in the exams. And when it comes to reading, apparently non-serif fonts are generally better for reading. So things like Arial, and Arial's really, when it comes to accessibility and just kind of clarity, cleanliness, just kind of straightforward, Arial is pretty much top of the list. So that's
sense.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. So Arial, yes, is pretty much the font that we use in GCSE maths papers.
Yeah.
But we do occasionally use Comic Sans because that is another clear font. But with very good reason, occasionally in exams, we want to present kind of a different voice or some student working. So, for example, we might have a question where it's kind of a character, and here's the top 2 lines of their working, carry on the next 3 lines of their working, or so-and-so says something, spot the error in what they're saying. And so you want to make it clear to the reader, the student, that what we have here on the page is not kind of the examiner text. It's kind of the voice of the student or the character, or it's someone's working. And kind of Comic Sans does look a little bit like handwriting. So we use it occasionally, in short, is what I'm saying. It sort of maintains a lot of that accessibility, though. But Arial's pretty much the standard.
JBL has commented saying the thousands of students who excel at GCSE maths don't seem troubled by fonts or how questions are framed. Yeah, I agree with you, JBL. That's the whole point, isn't it? I mean, the ones who don't struggle are the ones who excel regardless of the things. Whereas I think there's some students who, I genuinely think it's actually quite important to discuss things like this, the fonts and the wording and how questions are framed and all. I just think it's crucial.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's about inclusion and making sure all students are able to do maths. And yeah, I'm sure there are plenty of students that could do maths if it was in time, kind of some crazy font, I don't know, Wingdings or something like that. I'm sure that'll be fine.
But some
classic fonts here.
I reckon if you could decode and hold a maths exam paper in Wingdings, I think you'd absolutely be on for a 9. Whole code breaking activity thrown in at the side.
Sorry, it was the first font that came to mind. It wasn't most sensible of anyway. But yeah, I mean, this is something that we're very much thinking about. And in terms of feedback that we're getting from, centres and teachers and things like that, we obviously speak a lot about accessibility, and it's something that teachers are telling us that we are doing really well at. And they're coming to us and saying that it is a specific help for their lower ability learners. And if, I'm not going to really go into data on our entry. I can do if needed. But in short, our entry at the moment, we are seeing a lot of centres who hadn't been OCR historically whatsoever. And they're now entering foundation tier learners with us. And, we think, foundation tier only? Why? And you sort of have the conversation with, the teachers, and it's kind of, they're telling us that it's particularly with those lower ability students that perhaps if you kind of crack accessibility and do that really well, it perhaps enables them to sort of climb up a couple of extra steps. And it might even, with some of those students, be sort of what was holding them back. I mean, we hear from a lot of students that, that they are really good at maths, but their language skills, they're not as strong as we would like. And so if you present the questions in a way, they can access them, that, opens up that world to them. So, yeah, we have seen a huge amount of centres bringing foundation tier learners to us, and they're telling us it's because of the accessibility. And we're obviously hopeful that in time they bring their higher tier learners over to us as well. And all of this is for the benefit of all students, but perhaps it does give the lower ability students a bit of extra move to try it, on the assumption that it was perhaps accessibility that might have been holding them back previously. Obviously, every student
feels very much like you're kind of saying it's about like an equitable playing field, really, isn't it? It's about them being able to all access it and show what they know. So I guess we're looking here. You've already said there's like low prior attainers that you're kind of you think this is really helping the most. Are there any other considerations that you're kind of really honing in on in terms of accessibility needs at OCR? Is there anything else that's like really clear to you that you need to make accessible for specific students?
I think perhaps to turn the question around, I think it's perhaps interesting the way that a lot of what we're doing for accessibility for standard papers has come out of what we were perhaps doing previously for modified papers. So, for years, I don't know how long, but decades, let's say, before I was at OCR, we've always been producing modified papers, visually and enlarged and kind of kind of braille and various different sorts of papers for students. And some of the things that were amended in those papers we were sort of wondering, oh, why do you change this? And it's kind of, oh, because it's better for visually impaired students. It's kind of how we read, and it kind of helps them along. And then you sort of start to think, why don't we just do that for everybody then? So, for example, in the modified papers, we, 10 years ago, we were left aligning everything because in the English speaking world, we read on the page from left to right. So if things are on the left-hand side of the page, they're much more easily spotted by the reader than if something's floating off on the right-hand side. You can sometimes miss it because, you're reading down the page. And, now there's a lot of research kind of like tracking where people's eyes read on the paper, and it's all down the left-hand side. And so for years, we were left aligning everything in the modified papers. And, the people creating those papers knew full well, you put things on the left-hand side, people spot it. And then it was just kind of like a light bulb kind of, why don't we just do that for everybody then? So that's one of the accessibility principles that's in our guidance. We'd left align pretty much everything, not everything, and I can go into that if needed, but pretty much everything now in our GCSE maths papers and other papers is left aligned just because it's clearer for students. So that's not answering your question because I turned it around, but I think that's kind of.
I think it's good. It was a really good answer.
Interesting thing that kind of, sometimes, these things, they start off with kind of like looking at particular groups of students, and then you kind of build them into the full set, the standard papers. So,
and I think that's something that teachers will really identify with as well, because whenever you do training that's about a specific like SEND requirement, you quite often end up thinking, doesn't this just help everybody? Like we do this for this learner because it reduces cognitive load for this condition or whatever. And you think, well, if it reduces cognitive load for them, it's going to reduce cognitive load for everybody, surely. So why aren't we doing it in general? Like we should build this into our general principles. Are there any other principles that you guys want to talk about that maybe have come from those from kind of discussions about specific needs, or if there's things that you think more generally apply to all students?
There is there's an example. So I mean, I've been through many iterations of our GCSE maths qualifications. So back then it used to be, what can we do to make it look nicer? And we'd often have pictures. They didn't do anything other than they were just there to make it look slightly friendlier. And then at some point, it was just like, again, from modified papers, well, this isn't necessary. This doesn't add to the question. Let's take it out. And then there was that shift again where, well, it's not helping anybody really. Let's just get it out the paper. So it's often, as Neil said, it's the modified papers that you then think, well, let's make it more, accessible for everybody. So that was just one. We used to call them fluffy bunnies. So we went through a phase where it's like we need to get the fluffy bunnies out the paper, and now anything in there is needed for the question. So you can, you don't have to ignore things. Everything is relevant.
Can I play devil's advocate?
Sorry, go on, Tom.
Second, and say, there will be those out there who say, well, we've watered down everything so much. We've made things too easy. We've made things almost too accessible. We've made them, there will be people out there who say, harking back to the old days when I set exams, back in the 60s and 70s, it really was a challenge. And there'll be those also who might say, well, is it the role of maths within the curriculum to support literacy and support all these other areas? So therefore we should keep that sort of literacy challenge in there because it's something that is the responsibility of everybody to challenge students on, or to look to embed into their own qualifications. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, as I say, it's one of the key things about our accessibility principles is that you are assessing the content of that exam. There are English exams which will assess their literacy and the rest of it. Obviously, they have to have mathematical literacy. They actually need to be able to understand the question, but they have other exams for testing other things. If we want them to do maths, then it shouldn't be, I need to plough through all this English first. it makes it accessible for everybody, and those who are, the more able, the high achieving, it's not going to matter so much to them if you've got extra and they've got to decide which information is relevant. Whereas for those at the lower end, it just makes it so much harder, and it doesn't do the higher achieving candidates a disservice by stripping stuff out, because there's still questions aimed for them at that, at the top level. So it's making it level. It's a level playing field.
Well, yeah, and I think it's also important to separate accessibility with level of demand. I mean, what we're talking about here is making the questions kind of accessible so people can be tested on the maths, but that doesn't mean that the maths is kind of easier or harder. We've still got particularly, challenging questions, kind of like across the full range of, GCSE maths, and even colleagues working in A-level further maths qualifications, and they're still looking at accessibility, and a lot of the accessibility principles that we have for GCSE maths are also considered for A-level further maths. So it's that they are two separate things, and I know it's kind of very easy to talk about making questions more accessible and describe that as making them easier, but we're not making the maths any easier. We're just allowing students to kind of get to the maths really without being, distracted by crazy long sentences or, things like that.
Is there a space for questions where there is almost like superfluous information to ascertain if a student really understands a concept? I'm thinking things like we're not talking about entirely stripping out things that would identify that they understand the maths. So things like at the most basic level I can think, you give students a triangle and it has multiple sides labeled, and you ask them and heights and things labeled, and you ask them to find the area. Then being able to identify the correct height as the perpendicular height would still be something you're interested in asking them questions about at that stage, or is that something you also consider is not it wouldn't make that paper accessible to them?
So in questions, we wouldn't give information that is not relevant at all. So all the information on the page would be needed. However, it's kind of, there might be a problem-solving question where we don't necessarily give all the information that's required, and students need to make a kind of a initial calculation to find a particular dimension on a triangle or something like that. The thing that you start to have to think about the layout and the presentation and the design of questions is perhaps when a question is perhaps broken into parts. So you've got part A, part B, and part C. And you might have a diagram at the top, which might be a triangle. That's what you mentioned at the start. So we'll stick with that. And there might be kind of sides labeled on that, or an angle or whatever, that is relevant for part C. But it's obviously, if it's up at the top in the diagram and you want the diagram to be at the top, some of these things might come later on. So they do come into questions, but not in a way that there's going to be something that is not required whatsoever.
So it's assessed kind of carefully. You're kind of scaffolding that question so that you ask lots of things about the information you've given, but maybe not all of it at the same time. But there's never anything totally irrelevant on that page. I think that's a really nice principle, actually, to think about as teachers as well, as something you could take into your own classroom. I think we're sometimes quite guilty of trying to do one of those questions where you're like, I caught you out, that's not the slant height. But knowing that doesn't happen in an exam is quite a nice thing to be reassured about, that maybe you don't need to prepare them for that eventuality quite so harshly.
I mean, in short, it's not going to be in there. I mean, there is always some kind of there's often confusion when it comes to students responding. They'll use the slant height rather than particularly if it's a problem solving question. But that's kind of going off on a tangent to the discussion. But in short, there won't be any superfluous information in the questions. It'll all be necessary.
You've mentioned earlier on about having lots of people coming to you for foundation tier because of accessibility in particular. Is there a difference in what accessibility looks like in foundation and higher? Again, thinking about it's not being conflated with difficulty.
Not at all. The assessment, the accessibility principles apply to all assessment materials. Not all subjects have tiers. There's only a few of us that do, maths being one of them. But it's the same principles applying across all assessments. There's nothing different between the tiers. That's all.
Brilliant. That's really nice to know as well. And I think that's really encouraging for people to think again about the fact that it's not about difficulty. It's about people being able to do the maths that you're asking them to do and show that off, which is sometimes, I think, not what teachers think about, and definitely what students think about for exams. They don't think that it's about showing off what you know. It's quite nice to feel that that's what you're thinking about. You mentioned that you've had some feedback from centres earlier on about particularly like kind of font choices and how that kind of works. Is there any other feedback you've had that for things that you've done particularly well that centres are really happy with?
Yeah, for sure. So command words, that kind of comes into accessibility. So we publish glossaries of command words. So kind of the kind of explanations of, what does prove mean? What does show that mean? What's the difference between plottograph and sketchograph? Things like that. So that's something that's been, well received. Another thing that we've done that I think quite a lot of centres have remarked on and, positively is we've published a list of character names. So it's not all that common that we kind of have characters popping up in questions, but they're there occasionally, and when they are there, it's because there's a need. Perhaps there might be two people in a question and you want to kind of distinguish between them, so you name them. And we had an exam, I can't remember when it was, 2019 I think, maybe 2018, and we back then we didn't have a list of character names. It was just kind of the examiners coming up with whatever names, and there was kind of a wide variety of names, but we used a name in a paper that was perhaps a bit unusual. And after the exam, we saw on social media all these comments from students popping up, and they all seemed to be about this one name of this one character, which in a sense, maybe that was good. They weren't sort of saying, "Oh, this question was awful," or "What a horrible paper." There wasn't really any of that. It was all about this name. But we kind of recognise that, if at the end of the day students were being distracted by that name and perhaps wondering what it was, is this a name? Is this what is this? We do not want to be distracting students in a paper. We want those students to be in there focusing on the maths and not kind of sitting scratching their heads about a name or laughing at a name or what. There was a wide variety of responses, but anyway, so that essentially led to us saying, well, hang on, we ought to draw up a list of character names. So we have done. It's published, it's available, and there was a huge amount of thought going into that. So they were all short, generally one syllable names, but generally names that you can look at and just understand how it reads. It's not kind of unusual names and things like that do exist. There's a lot of gender neutral names in there because we obviously want to recognize that names of people, but we don't necessarily want to attach genders. That's not necessarily important. So we've got a large variety of those and kind of different cultures and backgrounds reflected. So we've got, we drew up that names list, and I think it was about 5-6 years ago. And I think that's been one of, that's certainly been something that a lot of centres have remarked upon.
Does that mean that you think that those centres take those names and kind of almost like would you encourage them to increase familiarity with their own students if they're going to sit your exams? Rather than me choosing my mum and dad, Debbie and Paul, who are always my go-to, and Debbie was always wrong because she's terrible at maths, you'd pick some of the names off your list instead.
And also because we're using them in all of our assessments, when teachers are using past papers, or some, previous papers, those names will be coming up. It'll just be them. So there's that familiarity built in, which again is a massive thing when it comes to accessibility.
Yeah, I mean, that's why they're published, so centres can use them. But yeah, we encourage centres, use them in teaching in the classroom, or perhaps if you're a teacher that writes your own resources and you're wanting to write a resource for our qualifications, then, please do use them. And, I've had conversations as well with centres that say, well, we don't think our students really struggle with that. They're fine. So fine, no problem. If you don't want to use them, you don't have to. But there are definitely students out there who would benefit and just feel a bit more comfortable with a bit more familiarity when they're going into that exam. Obviously, exams are, stressful things. And if this is one thing that we can do, even if it's only kind of one student in 10,000 that it kind of has a benefit for, well, good.
It's benefits somebody.
Yeah. And, there's definitely people that then, just like that familiarity going into the exam. But kind of coming round again, talking about another thing, slightly different topic, but kind of, was it Debbie you mentioned earlier that was always wrong?
Yeah, my mum's always wrong.
I mean, that's the kind of thing that we would really not want to do, because, there's, different, people have maths anxiety and things like that, and we can look at the genders, and perhaps it does, research tells us that it can be a bit more prevalent in girls. And so when it comes to the characters that we are, that do pop up in the papers, we're really conscious of, if we've got one of those questions where here's a student or here's a character doing something and they've done it mathematically wrong, spot the error, those sorts of questions, we are, conscious that we don't always want it to be a particular characteristic of individual that's always getting things wrong in our papers. So, that's a definite thing that we are kind of keeping watch out for. I mean, that's a bit separate to accessibility. That's more going into kind of EDIB, but it's kind of, it's all part of, kind of just making sure that the students are kind of going into the exam a bit more, just kind of making sure that they're comfortable and all that kind of thing.
So I'll be very clear, just so that no one thinks that I'm picking on my mum. She gave full clearance because she got me to teach her GCSE when she was in her 50s, and she was. I have full permission to use any of the mistakes she made with the students and ask them to help her correct them. So it's not that I was picking on her, and it's definitely not that she was always the wrong person, but she quite often wanted help with her homework. Sorry, Tom.
Also, it's nice to say 1,000 viewers on all platforms now. Thanks, Lucy, for sending that through in the background there at TTR Towers. 1,000 viewers on all platforms. Thanks very much for joining us. Just shows you there is. I genuinely, for me as a history teacher, there's still quite a lot I'm taking from this, just in terms of things I hadn't really thought about in our exams and in our even just the way we formulate stuff for students. So it's really nice to hear that OCR and you in particular are thinking about this. So yeah, it's been great so far.
I think it's just in general really nice that you keep coming back to the idea that these principles are across all of the papers and across all of your subjects, but we're talking about the math specifics today as well. So obviously it will apply to those other subjects, Tom, which is really nice for you to know and for everybody else. You just mentioned familiarity a lot in kind of that last section. I'm just wondering about how you kind of weave that into questions with contexts. Like what kind of impact does accessibility have for those kind of questions?
Do you want me to?
That was such a big sigh from Neil. Then, like, oh, this is a big one.
I'm sorry, if you want to go for it, although I can always chime in anytime.
Oh my God, sorry. Now, remind me. Question. Sorry, Kathryn.
The impact of context on questions.
Yes. Okay. So, the context is interesting because we always get feedback after exams. Sometimes it's good, sometimes there's things they don't like, but there's been greater awareness as we've got to where we are now, in terms of not using words that have two meanings. And there are quite a few students where English isn't their first language, so that's something we're really aware of, and I would say much more aware now than we were 10-15 years ago on that. And also some of the language is quite old that was being used, so while it was grammatically correct, it wasn't relevant for the students who were in school at that time doing the exam. So there is that move to making it as clear as possible that there's no double meanings, because again that can distract them, it can throw them, it can just interrupt what they're doing in the exam at that point. And sorry, Neil, you were going to say so.
I was just going to talk a bit more about context and kind of how, that comes into questions. So, yeah, I mean, context, you've got to be incredibly selective about kind of the particular context. And yeah, I mean, obviously the aim is for accessibility for all students. So you're kind of thinking about things that we're all going to universally do. You don't want to pick a particular sport to have a question about, because not all students might be familiar with that or whatever. So, I mean, that's kind of the reason why a lot of GCSE maths questions are perhaps about, going to the shops or going to a restaurant or perhaps catching a bus, things like that. It's a bit boring, but they hopefully are context that students will understand, and that we don't need to give kind of explanatory sentences kind of explaining the rules and things like that. I mean, I have seen papers from years ago that kind of explain half the rules of cricket before asking a question about cricket, or even worse, don't, and just expect the students to know what a six is and things like that. And it's just it's all this kind of excess knowledge that you're kind of relying on the student knowing that is probably not on a maths specification. Actually, you're just kind of assuming that there is this background contextual knowledge. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of a lot of the thinking that's going on, and we're kind of trying to write for the age of students. So there's an increasing number of questions about mobile phones and things like that, which is the sorts of things that we discuss context and kind of see what seems viable for the students. But it's a big part of setting, because obviously a context adds words as well. And we can explore this a bit more if kind of people want to discuss it, but it is part of the current requirements for GCSE maths at the moment that some questions are set in a non-mathematical context. So we do have to have them in there. It's a case of kind of figuring out, the proportion of them, and to what degree, you're kind of determining the context that appear in the papers.
I think that's something we've for me personally, looking at papers historically, you'll come across a question that you think, that absolutely knows, fractions, decimals, percentages questions in particular kind of spring to mind for this one. You put a context in that just is really needs explaining because people are going somewhere that isn't particularly usual, or for me, I've taught in a lot of schools that have students from quite kind of deprived areas of deprivation, and some of those contexts didn't make any sense to them. There were some of them that we would take on school trips to go to Waterstones because they'd never been to a bookshop before, so asking them questions about cricket would make no sense because they might have never ever thought of cricket as a thing, that they knew it existed, but they've never really spent any time on it. And it's not something they would need to. Again, it's really nice to know that we're kind of again focusing on that maths and not about kind of that background knowledge students might need. I would like at this point, I'm going to kind of talk about accessibility in the classroom and how you guys kind of help with that with other resources that are not just the exam papers. But while we are doing that, it'd be really nice if we could get some listener input. What do you guys do that are listening in your classroom to help your students for accessibility needs? What do you do to make sure that every one of your lessons is as accessible as possible? It could be stuff we've already talked about. It could be something different. And also, again, if you've got some questions, please fire them over and Tom will make sure that they make their way over to us.
Yeah.
A question again to you guys, Neil and Caroline, if you could tell me, what do you guys provide teachers with, as well as the things like the command word, glossaries and those names, what other things do you provide to help teachers with accessibility in the run up to their exams?
Do you want to take that one? Or
you go first.
Well, I think the main document that hopefully collects it all together is what we call our Explaining Our Question Papers guide. So this is one of the resources that's just on the public website. It's not kind of like locked away on our secure site for teachers. It is on there, but it's also on the public website. So the Exploring Our Question Papers guide basically collects everything that we've been talking about. It's got the accessibility principles in there. It's got the command word glossary. It's got the character names. So that is probably the first one that I would suggest.
Caroline, do you want to add anything to that while Neil quietly dies in the background there?
I could feel my voice slowly going.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, Explore It, that guide is, we wanted to try and put it in one document, what our question papers, how they were produced, the thinking behind it. So there's that, which is useful probably for teachers, but there are obviously, as Neil said, the command lists, and you can print them out and have them up, display them. But for the students, I would say that although our accessibility principles, they're written for assessment material, so that's anything that could be put in front of a student in a controlled environment and controlled conditions, we use those same accessibility principles in our resources as well, because there's no point us putting out something as a resource for students to practice with and then it not looking like what they're going to get when they walk into that exam room 6 months, a year later, whenever it is. So we're always very conscious that anything we produce, it's got to feel like a maths paper. It's got to have that same familiarity, sorry to use that word again.
I think it's really nice that that's a common thread through everything.
Yeah, so as I say, anything that we produce, then yes, we are working to that. And obviously, as Neil said, we started developing this particular qualification nearly a decade ago, and I'd say even from then we have improved. We know more, there's more research. It's one of those things, accessibility, that it's never just, we can tick that, we've done it, great.
Because never done.
There's always, as I say, new research. It might be that we do something in an exam and then we get a lot of feedback on it. And it's just that continual, it's conversations with teachers when we're on our centre visits, when we're at conferences, it all feeds in, and it's not something that's ever going to be done. It's always going to keep evolving so that it stays relevant. And yeah,
and I think it generally has to be a gradual progression as well, because another big thing about accessibility is familiarity, as we've said several times before. So if you suddenly find that a new way of writing a question is more accessible, well, what do? Do you suddenly snap change all your questions to look a bit different, to be this more accessible version? Because that might not actually be an accessible way of doing it. If you do make a snap change, you've then got to make sure that you communicate it to centres and the words out there. And that's, we can do that, but it's a lot of work, and not everyone might see the message. The general better way of doing is to introduce these things gradually and make sure that kind of these changes are coming in incrementally, that they're kind of like building on the back of familiarity as well, so that you're not going in and making snap changes, because no one likes dealing with kind of great big changes, and no one wants to open up a question paper and say, gosh, I've never seen a question at all like that, particularly not the students. So it's all about making sure that we're also making things look quite similar to the past papers, but where we do make changes, they can be built in more gradually. I mean, some of them perhaps you don't necessarily need to kind of announce them, or like the names list. Previously that was just kind of like examiners putting in their names of their kids and the pets and things like that and just pulling names out of the air. Now that we've got a names list, well, that's fine, and we can drop that in and use it from now on. But that names list does change from time to time, and we need to consider how we need to update people on that. So it's maintaining that familiarity as well, and kind of like making these changes at the right pace, at the right time for the students as well, so that in short, no one gets surprised.
How do you balance that idea of familiarity with kind of wanting students to not, and teachers, I guess, not being able to almost like game the system and learn exactly what your papers should look like? How do you balance those two things? That might be quite a difficult question. It just kind of popped into my head.
Well, no, I mean, there's enough going on with the content and the assessment objectives and calculator versus non-calculator and things like that. There are enough variables going on with the question papers that are changing each year. Obviously within a fixed, set of boundaries, but differ from one year to the next. So we can have some questions that are kind of relatively similarly worded, even if they're assessing quite different areas of the content. So you can kind of build in this familiarity in the style of questions and things like that kind of cuts across a lot of these.
I have a question for everybody, actually. Well, before I say the question, 1,500 viewers on all platforms. Thank you very much. Keep watching, keep listening, keep texting us. I had a few texts. I'll read them out later. At the end, maybe, so if we have time. I wanted to ask how artificial intelligence has impacted on your thinking when it comes to the creation of exam materials, or even your thinking just from a general sense on the exam formulation, or how exams should be sat for students. The reason I ask that is, okay, classic maths exam, calculator paper, non-calculator paper, just what you were saying. But does AI have a role to play in any of this, or are you saying that things are going to stay as they are, or do you think that things should evolve further?
I mean, perhaps in the future. I think perhaps the first port of call, if we go down that route with maths, is probably not exams. It's perhaps more resources and kind of looking at AI to perhaps produce worksheets or little topic tests or things like that, where we can explore its capability in a bit of a less higher stakes arena. Perhaps in future, we could perhaps look to, getting AI to write questions, but I think that they would very, strongly have to be reviewed by
they need a lot of QA
to be able to drop them in. And perhaps, I don't know, I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head here, but it perhaps might have to be that they were writing the kind of the more calculate with a calculation and work out with a, rather than perhaps the more involved questions. I don't know, but yeah.
I mean, AI is going to change the workplace, and people often say, well, these are the jobs that it will have less effect on. Jobs that are, creative, for example, it could potentially, I guess, have, they always will, right? But how does it play into maths? Because yeah, I don't know. I'm playing.
I think for me personally, I don't think I can't trust some kind of like large language model at the moment as it is to kind of give me any reliable set of maths questions that it can answer correctly. I think we've only just got past the point where you can't convince it that 1 + 1 isn't 2. Like, that's a very recent thing. Like, a lot of people convinced large language models that that wasn't the case. And until that kind of thing is fixed, I just don't have any confidence that it could be used even by a classroom teacher, let alone by Neil and Caroline and then their team of like actual exam writers to do anything that doesn't need significant QA.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps it will sort of change the roles, perhaps in, I don't know how long, but years, some X years, we might have kind of a system where it perhaps might write questions, and
this is
then
in
have
that
more people.
A lot of what we've talked about you can sort of see a scenario where a student could say to an AI bot or whatever it was, can you rewrite this question for me in a way that I can understand it? Not maybe the words, but the whole actual, I can sort of see a scenario.
Can you explain to me what X, Y, and Z is in this question? Is this thing a name?
Right. Or can you put this in another context for me to help me understand? I mean, again, it couldn't give an answer, but it could give another example of the same question, maybe. Or, I don't know. I'm just sort of thinking how it may play out down the line.
Yeah, I mean, they're possible avenues. I mean, perhaps again, kind of looking at kind of in the classroom, perhaps, what you've described sounds like it would be very useful. For assessment, that kind of thing might be quite a long way off, but perhaps, there are a lot of conversations going on right now about exams and technology and what we're going to be looking at in the future, and kind of could students be doing exams on computer and things like that. And all of that is what people are talking about. And there's a lot of pros and cons that I'm not really going to go into right now. But in short, perhaps that is a viable place where AI could be, used if maths exams move into technology, is kind of, particularly if students are struggling to understand a question, and perhaps if that might be the way that the wider world works at that time.
Because a calculator, like back in the day in the 90s when I was in school, it's like, we've got a calculator. It sort of changed the paradigm a little bit, didn't it? In just for kids, I mean. And I just wonder now with AI, is it the same thing with like working out? Do the calculator. I've got the answer. Why are you asking me to show AI? What's the working out for this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps it maybe comes back to thinking about the calculator, and the calculator is obviously well and good, but students have got to know how to use it. And so you're therefore, part of your maths lessons is teaching students how to use a calculator. Do you want to have a maths lesson where you're teaching students how to use AI? I don't know. Some people might do. Other people might not be so keen on that kind of thing. But yeah, it's all about kind of thinking about the tools and the technology that are around to us. I mean, there's a lot of negative talk about AI. So a lot of people are focusing on, well, what are the positives? And perhaps this kind of could be done, in some way. But again, it kind of comes back to, what are we wanting to test students on? If we're wanting to test them on the maths, maybe having an exam that requires knowledge of how to use AI as well is not an accessible maths exam, perhaps.
Looping back to kind of possibly less futuristic uses of technology, how do you think technology helps with accessibility at the moment, and how do you think it could change in the future? Not with AI, perhaps.
I was going to say, so there's obviously a lot of talk about exams going digital, and there are subjects where they've got digital exams coming up. So I know we've got computer science one. and the stuff taking part, these are happening. And there's always a really interesting discussion to be had for maths in, how can we take it all completely online? So actually maybe for maths, at least initially, it's done like this formative, it could be used as formative assessment. And I think, again, it's going to benefit some students, those who already use a laptop as assistance within their exams. Then for them, maybe that's something that it would actually make it easier for those. They're used to it. It's in a format they can do. I don't know. I mean, I can't see at this point it being rolled out to everyone who's going to sit their GCSE maths exams online, because there's a whole host of, everyone knows, resources, time, space, and all the rest of it. So I think formative, it could come in.
I think some things for accessibility it might make easier. You could enlarge the larger screens, be quite easier to do, or if kind of you need, some students need coloured paper for their exams, that would be quite easy just to switch around the background colour of a screen rather than kind of having to order a particular colour paper and things like that. So you'll definitely make some things easier when it comes to accessibility. But then again, you've got to go down that route of, then you've got to make sure that the students are familiar with how to enter algebra on a screen and all that kind of stuff.
Question from JBL: would it be helpful to encourage students to work on the specific skills that competent mathematicians obviously have?
Be interested to know what he means by specific skills. What specific skills do you mean?
Yeah, I would. JBL, you'll have to expand. Come back to us.
Might be a bit subjective, that one.
You've mentioned a few times kind of feedback and research that's come into your considerations with kind of adapting the off-qual principles and making your own. What research might people be interested in having a look at that's maybe changed your thinking the most? Anything interesting you've found out? I really liked that bit before about the fact that there's countless papers on font. It's just blowing my mind that that's what people spend their time on.
I mean, I've sort of touched on the ones already. I mean, kind of like the fonts is kind of an interesting one. I mean, the left aligning as well, I found quite interesting as well. Just kind of and I've seen on television kind of eye tracking maps and sort of little heat maps, and it's all highlighted down the left hand side. So what else haven't we mentioned?
I don't know, I'm not quite sure.
You have mentioned an awful lot of things. It was just an opportunity to scoop anything up if you hadn't quite got into the forefront of your mind yet. In which case, how can people feed back to you? You've mentioned that quite a lot, that you hear a lot back from centres, and we've seen that students in particular like a whinge on social media. What would you prefer people do if they wanted to talk to you about accessibility in your maths exams?
Well, I mean, just get in touch. I mean, on the website, there's kind of the email address, phone number, and social media details for the team. So just get in touch anytime. I mean, the email address is just maths@ocr.org.uk. So get in touch with us anytime. What we do specifically, though, is after the summer exam series, we always run a post-exam survey. So we kind of make sure that, we're announcing that to as wide a range of people as we can. So shouting about that on social media, getting it in our newsletters and communications and things like that, because after the exams we definitely do want to hear what people say, positive or negative, because if people don't tell us, then we're not going to know, are we? And we want to be setting exams that are as accessible as possible for students, and we can do that by looking at all the research and doing all the stuff and preparation before the exam. But we need to know how it actually works and how it impacts students, and if things are having a benefit, or definitely if things don't have a benefit, if we do something and it doesn't, perhaps have the effect that was intended, we want to know about it. So yeah, in short, we do a big post-exam survey after the exams as well. So that aims to capture all the feedback kind of immediately after students are set the qualification, the exams. So
I was going to ask, is there anything that you feel you either sort of, again, I don't want to get into sort of, oh, we're better than them and we're better than them. However, I did want to ask you if there's anything that you feel you're doing either differently or uniquely, or maybe just something where you feel you're a sector leader on when it comes to accessibility in maths. Is there anything where you look at it and you say, you know what, I'm really proud of this particular element or this particular thing that we're doing? I mean, obviously, you're just from an outsider's perspective, it's obvious you're putting good time and resource into thinking about this. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. That's blatantly obvious. But I wondered from a, on a practical term, is there anything that sort of stands out for you where you think, yeah, we're doing a really good job on there?
I mean, it's more about the whole package and how it all comes together. There's a lot of fine little bits, and there are elements of that we perhaps talk about a bit more, and we have done through the course of today's session. Yeah. But the thing that I'd like most is just the fact that we are thinking about it and focusing on it and really diving into all of this, and we're having a look at the research, and all of these little bits are all coming together, and it's about kind of thinking about, all students, making sure that all of them are as fully prepared as can be when it comes to the exams. And it's all of these little moving pieces that go into question paper writing, and they all, kind of come together and work together. And specific one. And Caroline is the one that.
No, I think it is, as you say, there's no one thing. I mean, some of the things we do for accessibility they sound so simple, and we'll have short sentences. Okay, great, but it's it all combined together that makes it more accessible for the candidates, and it's hard to pinpoint any one particular thing.
Okay, yeah. I can perhaps give one then that we haven't. It's just come into my head that we haven't spoken about whatsoever, and is actually generally one of those things that a number of teachers have cited that they really like, and I'm surprised I've not mentioned it so far today. Which is when it comes to the answer lines, we put a lot of little prompts in them, and a lot of centres have picked up on this and said it works really well. So if, for example, there's someone in a question and they're doing something, and students have got to decide whether they're right or wrong and give a reason. We won't just kind of give blank working space for them to write all of that in. We won't just give them answer lines to write it in. We'll give them a bit of working space and answer lines, but crucially, the answer lines have got little prompts in them to help students recognize and understand the sort of response that's required. So if it's a question that I just described, it sort of will have a little bit at the front of the answer lines for them to give the decision whether the character is right or wrong. And then it will say, in the answer line, it will literally say because, and then the answer lines carries on. So that word because there helps the students to recognize, well, there's two parts to this answer line. There's a bit before the because and a bit after. And the word because means, we've got to give a reason.
Yeah.
So a lot of little things like that.
That's really powerful.
Yeah. And, if a question, if it's solving a quadratic, something like that, we'll have two little answer lines, and each will say kind of x equals ... or x equals ... putting, symbols in the units in answer lines as well, again helping students understand what's required. If a question asks students to find the value of, I don't know, b, it'll have, b equals on the answer line, even if it's only just one thing. It will still say b equals. there just to help students understand what it is they're trying to do. And that is another thing that's part of accessibility as well. It's not just about the questions. And I think throughout today, we've been talking about the questions, and, that's reasonable. There's a huge amount of thought goes on into the questions, but it's also thinking about how students are going to respond and making sure that the answer space is the appropriate size, the answer lines are sufficient in number, and any little prompts, any little directions within them that we can give students is that also a big part of accessibility. And that is, as I say, really one thing that a lot of centres have picked up on and said that they like from us recently.
And is that something they're picking up on because it's a bit more specific to OCR maths and what you're doing, if you know what I mean? Is that something they're saying, you're doing this and we appreciate it, sort of thing?
I believe so. Yeah, I mean,
I don't know.
Yeah,
for sure.
I mean, I've seen other boards' papers. I'm so sure we all kind of like have a look around at each other's papers. It's not something I've never necessarily noticed is particularly prevalent in other boards' papers. And yeah, I think the fact that teachers are coming to us and saying, "Oh, I like that," kind of implies that it's perhaps isn't really out there to
not
the same
usual.
degree in other boards. So,
See, I knew there was something, guys. All right. Said there was nothing. I knew there was something.
Yeah, it's been focused on questions so long that I forgot about the answer. Yeah, got around to it in the end.
Brilliant.
I don't think I've really got too much more to ask you, really. I think that's a really nice note to end on, that you're kind of doing stuff that in general is just really allowing students to be successful. And I think that maybe that's the crux of everything we've been talking about all evening. What can we do in lessons, in the run up to exams, and in those examinations themselves to make sure the students can show us exactly what they know to the best of their ability? And sometimes that falls by the wayside because you're so focused on content and getting through stuff. But yeah, it's definitely a big message for all of us to take away. Thank you very much for your time, guys. I really appreciate it.
It was amazing. We've had nearly 2,500 viewers across our various different platforms. So thank you very much to everybody who's watched along and engaged. A special thanks, obviously, to Caroline and Neil from OCR Maths. If you want to find out more, follow them. Follow OCR Maths. Go and seek them out on X, or I'm not sure. Are you on LinkedIn specifically for OCR Maths, or is it just OCR in general on LinkedIn? They could find you on there.
Yeah, it's only OCR that I think has got a specific profile. We're thinking a lot about social media right now, so but in short, kind of X.
It's a bit of a weird world out there for social media at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, we're having a lot of conversations about that. Let's just leave it at that. But
you can visit Neil, Caroline, and the OCR Maths team on the OCR Maths website and just drop them a line, inquire, ask them what's going on if you want to find out more about accessibility in maths and what OCR are doing for accessibility in maths. Hopefully you found out quite a lot about it tonight. So thank you very much. We'll be back in 12 minutes time, because Danielle is on live through the website talking about fads in teaching. So if you want to listen to that, you can click listen live on the ttradio.org website at 9 o'clock. So in about 11 minutes, and listen to her talking about fads, which is actually a part 2, because she spent part 1 talking about it 2 weeks ago. So it's another set of fads. I'm looking forward to it. I always enjoy listening to people rant about fads in teaching. It's very entertaining. So thank you very much, everyone. We'll be back soon. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Caroline. And a massive thank you to Kathryn and also Lucy, who's been in the background at TTR Towers doing all sorts of other things, including telling me that we've reached so many live viewers. So thank you, everyone. Cheers. Good evening. Wave. Bye.
Night.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.